Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Deron Chavis with Natural Movement. I'm here with Amir Muhammad from Collections and Stories of American Muslims. And we're here to talk about some of the early American relationships to Islam. We're here at the Cabell Library at Virginia Commonwealth University, and we just want to find out what some important aspects of Islam that we find in early American stories.
History. Well, really, the early history of Muslims in America comes in like four different waves, major waves. One of the first major waves is they came here as explorers from Abu Bakr, Mansa Musa's West Africans, way before Christopher Columbus. The first documentation of them arriving here was in 1312, traveling through the Mississippi, going through Colombia, Panama, Cuba, and South America regions, to the point that even when Christopher Columbus started arriving here, he wrote in his log journals, rooms along mosques in Cuba and in Panama, and women wearing turbans, and they're using the same type of gold that they used in West Africa. You find his reports. You find Professor Van Sertiman, they came before Columbus, writes about Africa's early presence. You had Barry Fells, wrote a book, Professor Barry Fells wrote a book on Saga of America, talk about the early presence of Muslims living in southwestern parts of America and the Four Corners. Then you had a wave of Muslims that came here through the Spanish Inquisition, some of them running from the Spanish Inquisition, some of them being freed, and some of them being with the Spaniards. One of the first ones that we were aware of was taught by J.A. Rogers, called Little Stevens. His name we know him as Little Stevens, but in American history is known as Estevanico. He's credited with discovering Arizona and New Mexico. He was the first explorer to go into that area. Then some of the other descendants that came through the Spanish Inquisition became known as, first they was known as Moriscos, and then they became known as Melungeons. And these Melungeons lived in the Appalachian Mountains, in Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and they still live there today. They say that Elvis Presley's mother was a Melungeon. They say that Abraham Lincoln's mother was Melungeons. This is a part of the panel of the exhibit of some of the Melungeons to show you the different shades, the colors, where they brought them in. This is an article that the U.S. government did, talking about the Melungeons in Tennessee and the Melungeons in Virginia. And they was during the 1600s, they minted their own silver. They had their own culture and their own identity. Even when the Americans arrived in Jamestown, they told them, the Native Indians told them that there was some English people like them had full beards and prayed towards the rising of the sun, and they lived more inland. And these are known today as Melungeons.
Wow.
Another group of them that came here are the Moors of Delaware. These Moors married amongst the Navajo Indians. There's Muslims that also lived amongst what they call the Mohegan Indians up in Connecticut. There's a brother named Muhammad that was died in 1735, and the two Cub Scouts put a plaque honoring him in 1929. So you find these early Muslims and early Moors living in that area. Then you have in the 1700s, you have Moors or Muslims coming from Morocco, Saudi Morocco, petitioned the government in Arabic in 1753. They petitioned, there was two of them, Mahmoud Muhammad and Adel Khanna, petitioned the government all in Arabic, and it was a Jewish woman that did the translation of it, and they was able to get their freedom. Then in 1790, it was a group of 10 that petitioned the government and became known as the Moorish Sundry Act. Here is a panel that shows you some of the last names. You had the Guineas of West Virginia, the Jackson Whites of New York and New Jersey, your Melungeons of Virginia and Tennessee, some of their last names, Bowles, Collins, Fields, Freemans, Goins. You had the Moors of Delaware, and these Moors also lived in Bridgeton, New Jersey, their family last names. They married amongst the Navajo Indians. Many times we hear in the United States or most African American people, call some light-skinned people red bones, but there's a group of people that was known as red bones out of Louisiana. Their last names Butlers, Bagel, and so forth, Nelsons. And so you see some of their names. They call them from the Moorish breed and the Native Americans, living Indians.
Let me ask a question. Why do you think that in our conversations about African Americans, we don't really hear about the connection between people of African descent and people of Moor, and like in that concept of being Moor or Moorish? Why is that kind of like a disconnect?
Because one, we got to learn to tell our own story. As long as we have somebody else telling our story, they're going to tell it in their slant. And the story that we recorded is that they make you think that it was the Arabs that conquered Spain. But really, the North Africans, the first wave was your Berbers. The second wave were your Sub-Saharan Africans, your Moors, your Tangerines, your Wallachs, and they all was up in Spain, helped civilize Spain. Up in Spain, it was Muslims that brought, in Spain and Portugal, it was Muslims that brought the citrus fruits, the grapefruits, the lemons, the limes, the oranges. It was Muslims that brought that up in Spain. The bathhouses that was developed, it was the Muslims. Also, even with the educational system. Today, there's over 2,000 books and libraries that are in Timbuktu that was housed and written and educated by Africans, people of color, that is not being told. But we have to learn to come tell our own story.
Move down. One of the things from the presentation that I gathered a lot from was the conversation about early African captives being of Islamic culture.
Yes.
Specifically dealing with certain types of Africans being from different areas. Can you speak to some of those realities as well?
Yes. Here is one of the panels. They told us that we couldn't read and write. We have a history and a culture. But here shows you the type of Muslims that was brought here. Your Moors, your Tangerines, your Syrians, your Wallachs, your Mandinkas, your Hausas, your Fulanis, your Akans. And this is the area where they brought us from. For rice, indigo, cotton, and tobacco. It shows you the growth of Islam in Africa in the 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, 17th century. It really was in the 1500s when the Europeans finally got into Africa. Prior to that, 700 years, Muslims had lived and was educated in Africa, in many parts of Africa. The Songhai Empire, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire. These are a lot of the empires that they had. And this just shows you the different tribes and growth to the level that one of the first Muslims or scholars that we are aware of in America, his name was Job ibn Dujalo. Job ibn Dujalo in 1730, he wrote down the Quran 3 times from memory. He was one of the first Hafiz. Now, the problem with Job, he was also involved with slave trade. He had sold a few slaves, but he got captured himself and sold into slavery. But he made repentance or Tawbah to God, and he got obviously got a blessing, got forgiveness. He made it back out after only being a slave for 3 years. This is the article in 1750. This is what they call the precursor to the GQ magazine, Gentleman's Magazine. Talking about Fulanis. Don't bring no Fulanis into the United States. You can't convert them. If a man knows that God is greater than anything before, how you gonna tell him you're God, you're greater? But I gotta be subservient to you. They can't break them. They couldn't break them. Also from Job, the European world learned about the interior of Africa. Prior to that, they only knew the coast. They didn't know about the interior until they learned it from Job and Nijala. Then also in 1753, a group of Muslims from what they call the Barbary Coast Wars, the pirates. There's a wave of Muslims that came through the pirates, the naval aspects of it. And these are two of them. One named Adel Connor, the other was Mahmoud. 1753, and they petitioned the government all in Arabic for their freedom, and they won. It became known as the Moorish Sandra Act. In 1790, there was a group of 10 that petitioned the government to all in Arabic, and they won. And still today, it is called the Moorish Sandra Act.
Let me ask a question. It's interesting when we talk about time, 700 BC, the conquering of, the fall, well, conquering of Spain by,
The fall of
the fall of Spain by General Tariq of the Moors. Then we had the reign of Islam in Spain for 700 years up to 1492, when we were talking about the.
But the last great empire, the fall of Granada, happened in 1492.
Right.
Prior to that, for about 300 years, Muslims was losing different parts.
Right.
We became city-states. Before we was in one unit, we started becoming divided. And by becoming divided, they were conquered. And in 1492 was the fall of Granada.
And we actually, when we give credit a lot of times to, Columbus, he traveled across the Atlantic Ocean and everything and quote-unquote discovered the Americas. But earlier in one of the presentations you talked about Abu Bakr going across the ocean and trading with the indigenous. Isn't it kind of ironic that the precursor for travel across the Atlantic will be someone of Moorish descent, and then later on, at the fall of that Islamic empire, now all of a sudden you have this gentleman that's like, okay, well, let's go travel
because
across.
he learned about the stories that the Muslims traveled over to the Americas, what they call the Sea of the Fog. Remember now, they thought the world was flat at that time, but then they heard so many journeys that was being made and people were coming back. Also, you got to understand that Christopher Columbus had two Muslims captains on his ships, and he used Muslim maps. There was two of them, the Pinzar family were descendants of Muslims, and two of them was captains of his ships. This is what helped Columbus come over here, and really, it was a journey of discovery. He didn't discover anything. He just discovered that there's people here, culture and other things here. That was the journey. What can we discover? What can we get?
Right.
They conquered Spain. They got Spain back from the Africans, from the Muslims, from the Moors, and from the Berbers. Then that's when they started coming